Okay, folks, good evening. Hope everybody is well. I had two requests this week. One was a request for a story about the Baal Shem Tov, whose Yortzeit means the anniversary of his passing, will be celebrated next week, on Wednesday next week. And perhaps celebrated is not always the right word, maybe commemorated, but in the case of great sages and great saints, we actually celebrate their passing because more a celebration of their life rather than their death. In fact, as the sages state, tzaddikim, that means righteous people, righteous, saintly people, don't really ever pass on, so to speak. They might pass on physically, but their spiritual influence continues unabated and very often much greater than before. So it is the Baal Shem Tov's anniversary, the anniversary of his passing. He's passing on to a higher state of being. This coming Wednesday, and I was also asked if I could explain something about something I mentioned in a previous class about a person changing their will. How do you change your will? So let's get to both of those by, first of all, telling a story about the Baal Shem Tov, and then we'll examine the story in greater depth, and hopefully that will lead us to the answer that we seek. So, there's a story told about the Baal Shem Tov as follows. There was a time that in Europe, in Eastern Europe in particular, there was a huge wave of what they call pogroms. Pogrom, I think, is originally a Russian or Ukrainian word, but it basically means when Cossacks or later versions of the Cossacks, this was in the 1600s, 1700s, even the early 1800s, went and decimated communities all over Eastern Europe, Jewish communities, for no other reason than bloodthirsty sports or because they've been charged up to do so by people who had no scruples and morals and so on and so forth. And very often what had happened was in these communities were just made scapegoats by the local pirates, the local rulers, the governors or whatever, for their failings, to cover over their failings. They would always blame somebody else. And who better to blame than the Jewish communities, who were basically defenseless and depended on the state to provide them with defense. They didn't have weapons. They were kept in ghettos most of the time. They certainly didn't have the ability to defend themselves fully. So this is what happened. There were a lot of pogroms in it, certain periods of time. Very unfortunate period of time, but it happened. So this story takes place at around the time of Passover, 1756. Passover was the time, between Passover and Shavuot, the upcoming festival. Shavuot is the time that the Torah was given. It was 50 days later. There was the Exodus from Egypt. 50 days later, they received the Torah on Mount Sinai. So during this time, this was always a time in Eastern Europe when the pogroms were even greater, because Jews were accused of making matzahs, leavened bread, with the blood of Christian children. Obviously not true. We're not allowed to eat any blood, even of an animal. But in any event, that was prime time for pogroms. So on Passover 1756, so many of the followers of the Baal Shem Tov would come to Medzibush, that's where he lived, to spend the Pesach festival with their spiritual leader, their Rebbe. Usually it was a very uplifting experience, a sort of a magical experience almost, when people were lifted up and felt sort of transformed, not only when they were there, but it sort of carried into the year, at least for some months. However, on this Passover Eve, the Baal Shem Tov was in a very, very somber mood. And everyone got a sense that something was going wrong, something was terribly wrong. There was a sense of foreboding And the Baal Shem Tov was certainly not his usual buoyant and very sort of uplifted and uplifting self. So after the search for chametz, that's the search for leavened bread, which is done on the night before Passover. So the Baal Shem Tov called together the 10 of his closest disciples, and he told them to say Tikkun Chatzois. Tikkun Chatzois is the midnight prayer. Most people today don't say it. There are still some who say it, but midnight prayer is a prayer which binds together night and day, and it's called Tikkun Chatzois, the rectification of midnight, right? It's a rectification that's done at midnight, and it's quite a mystical prayer in all. In any event, he told 10 of his disciples to start the Tikkun Chatzois, which was unusual because on that night you usually don't say it. It's not said every single night of the year. But he told them to say Tikkun Chatzot, this midnight prayer, and he went off to his study. A few minutes later, Rabbi Tzvi, who was the secretary of the Baal Shem Tov, his attendant, his assistant, ran in and told all the gathered men who were saying Tikkun Chatzot that the Rebbe fainted. The Baal Shem Tov fainted. I understood from this was a very dire situation that he was facing. They didn't know what the issue was, but they understood it was a very dire situation. And they continued their fishing. They finished their Tikkun Chatzot. No one dared to go into the study of the Baal Shem Tov to see what was going on. You didn't come in unless you were invited. And next morning, they came to the synagogue, and they saw that the Baal Shem Tov was in a very, very somber, even a despondent mood, you could say. After the morning prayers, the Baal Shem Tov went up on the pulpit, I guess, and he delivered the following I'm saying it very briefly, I don't know how long it took him, but he delivered a speech talking about the concept of true and complete faith. True and complete faith in God occurs only when a person cannot really see his way out of a situation to overcome a problem, whatever it is. At that point, when a person sees no other choice, right, that's when he has to have absolute faith that God will no doubt help. Right? There's no doubt, without a doubt, God's going to help. How it's going to happen, I have no idea, but that it will happen, I'm convinced of. And not only does he have to express his faith, but he has to also be in a state of joy, because that shows that he is really fully relying on his faith, that he's relying on God in his faith, that nothing untoward is going to happen. In any event, all the preparations were made for the coming holiday, and the close students of the Baal Shem Tov were invited to his Seder. It's called the Seder, the order, that's the Passover meal. And the closest disciples came in, and they saw that the Baal Shem Tov was in somewhat of a better mood, but unlike his usual custom, he didn't explain the Haggadah. The Haggadah is a text that is read at the Passover Seder, telling about the history of slavery in Egypt and the redemption and so on and so forth. And usually the Baal Shem Tov would spend quite a long time explaining various aspects of this text. But on this occasion, he did not really explain anything. Near the end of the Seder, towards the end of this meal, the Baal Shem Tov closed his eyes and the disciples were silent. Then all of a sudden, the face of the Baal Shem Tov brightened, and he started laughing. And he was laughing heartily for a period of time. And then he proclaimed, Mazal Tov, congratulations. Thanks God. Let's give thanks to God. Now you know that even a simple and unlearned simple Jew, has the power to change a heavenly decree. He began to explain. What had happened was there was a terrible decree against a certain community in a nearby village, that they were going to be attacked by Cossacks, and basically the village was going to be wiped out. The peasants and the Cossacks were planning an attack, and things looked very dire. Of course, they didn't have any way really of defending themselves. So the Baal Shem Tov began to pray with all his strength, and he asked even his closest disciples to say Tiknu Chatzot to help him out. But even the Baal Shem Tov, with all his spiritual strength, could not overcome this heavenly decree. But finally, he gave up trying to overcome the decree, put his trust in God that the decree would be rescinded. And then he started to feel a little bit better. Once he'd come to that decision, he started to feel a little bit better and more at ease. By the time they sat down to the Seder, to the Passover meal, the hour for the execution of the decree had actually arrived. He did not see any hope for the people in that village, but things changed in an instant. What happened? There was a childless couple that lived in this village where the decree was to be executed. They were sitting at their table, the Seder table, just like everyone else on the night of Passover. They were simple, unlearned people, but exceptionally kind, exceptionally devout, and very replete with good deeds. They did a lot of good things for other people. They did not have any children of their own, but when they came to recite the Haggadah, so the husband recited the Haggadah in Hebrew as is traditional, and he started explaining a little bit, at least translating it for his wife. And when they came to the part about the Egyptians throwing newborn baby boys into the Nile River, the wife started to cry. And her husband comforted her, and he said, "My sweet wife, don't be sad. After all, the Jewish people finally they were taken out of Egypt and left Egypt." So the wife spoke back, and she said, "If God had blessed me with a child, I would have protected him. I would not have let anybody hurt him. I certainly wouldn't let anyone treat my son that way, throwing him into the Nile. How could God let us be treated that way by the Egyptians?" The husband took God's side, and he said, God is righteous in everything that he does. We don't understand why he does things, but surely it must be for the good. So the wife responded, "Why isn't God more compassionate? How could he have treated his people like that? Even if we do sin, we're still his children. We're all his children." And so the argument went back and forth, and as they progressed through the Haggadah. Simultaneously, the case against the Jews of that village was also being heard before the heavenly court. The defending angels were more than persuasive. The defending angels were very persuasive when the wife was talking, but the accusing angels were more persuasive when the husband was talking. I didn't know, the Baal Shem Tov said, I didn't know which way it was going to go, who was going to win the argument. Finally, after completing the fourth cup of wine, because we could drink 4 cups of wine on that night, after drinking the fourth cup of wine near the end of the Seder, the husband could not think of another answer to his wife's arguments. He couldn't think of of an answer. So he said to her, "My wife, you're right. God should have treated his children better." Then they both began to laugh, and they got up and they started dancing around the table. Right? They were very happy that they come to a conclusion, and they were dancing around the table, and they were dancing joyfully. After all, it is Yom Tov. It's a festival day. It's a holiday. They didn't know anything about the decree, obviously, but they were dancing happily. And that's when I began to laugh, said the Baal Shem Tov, because at that point, the whole decree was rescinded. The Baal Shem Tov, as he sometimes did, then told his disciples to gather around in a circle, and which they did, and he put his hands on the shoulders of the disciples sitting on either side of him, to the right and to the left, and told everyone to put their right hand on the next person's shoulder, making a circle, and then close their eyes. And when they closed their eyes, they actually saw the events as they unfolded. Right? They saw the husband and wife arguing in I suppose 2 times or 3 times the speed or whatever it is, but they saw the main events. And they saw the conclusion of the argument, the man and his wife dancing around the table and in a state of joy. And at that point in time, the Baal Shem Tov took his hands off the shoulders of his disciples, and everyone was now in a state of joy. They were in a state of smiling. Everyone was happy. Okay, that is the story. Now, what do we understand from the story? So we understand from the story the following idea. First of all, there is a concept of faith and there's a concept of joy. Let me explain what's going on. In order to be able to change the will, and we're talking here about the will, meaning the decree that happened, but the same thing applies when a person is trying to change his own will, right? In other words, a person has a will to certain kinds of things, sometimes, unfortunately, a will to self-destruction. Some people do that. But if there's not a will to self-destruction, but it nevertheless is not moving in a positive direction, it's not moving, so one has to change one's will, because the will is the source of everything else, right? Without the will being behind it, the quality of character would just crumble. Basically, we can apply this in terms of the Sfirot. As you can see in front of you, you have a Sfirot chart, a very common Sfirot chart that everybody has seen before. Again, if anybody wants a copy, just send me your email and I will send you a copy. You can also go to the website and go to the archives. There's an archive button that'll take you to Dropbox, and you should be able to find it over there. It is called Spheros and Powers, Sefiros and Powers, a PDF. Okay, you can have a look there, or you can just ask me and I'll send this an attachment. Okay, so where does the will exist? The will exists in Keter, right? That's Keter. The Keter is the highest of the Sfirot, Keser. And there are three, like a crown, a crown has sort of three tips to it, I suppose you could say. Let me see if I can make a sort of a drawing over here. No, it's not going to help. No, that wasn't what I wanted to do. Okay. No, that's not going to work. Yeah, maybe I'll do it like this. Let me see if I can. Just 1 second. Yeah, here we go. Right, so that would be your crown. I'm drawing with a mouse here, so you'll excuse my very poor drawing qualities. Okay, three heads to the crown. Okay, there is the highest one is called Radla, Reisha Delo Ityada, the beginning which is not known and cannot be known. As you see on the map over here, on the chart rather. That corresponds to Radla, corresponds to faith. Then there's one on the right side of the crown, which would be called Atik. Atik corresponds to delight. And finally, the left side of the crown, or the final head of the crown, which is called Arich. Arich is the will. Okay, so where is the will? The will is the third aspect of the crown. Now, the truth is that the way we've drawn them over here, they work seem to be almost parallel. But the truth is that they go sort of one above the other in many ways. Right? There's Radla, the highest one, and then there's Atik, and then Arich. Right? So Arich is the lowest level of Keter, and Arich is the one that basically is the engine behind all of the other attributes of the soul. The powers of the soul are controlled essentially by Arich. Arich is their source. They emerge from Arich. The first sphere to emerge from Arich is called Chochmah. Right? It comes out of nothingness. This is called nothingness because it's not manifested. In all the Sfirot, Keter is not manifested. It's a transcendent Sphira. And all three heads of the Keter are transcendent. But Chochmah is the first immanent Sphira. Right? Chochmah representing wisdom, intelligence, etc. Right? And from Chochmah, from Keter also comes Bina. There's a connection between Chochmah and Bina, but Bina has its own source essentially in Keter as well. And then you have the rest of the Sfirot, or the rest of the powers of the soul. Let me just remove all these drawings over here. Here we go. We have the rest of the powers of the soul, which are Chesed and Gvura. chesed, kindness, gvura, might, awe, fear, etc., tiferet, compassion, netzach, perseverance, hoid, acknowledgement, sincerity, yesod, influence, empathy, contribution beyond yourselves, malchut is the lowest of the sfirot, humility, significance, etc. As we explained on a number of different occasions. But the controlling switch of all of them is arich, right? The controlling switch of all of them is arich. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, if arich is the willpower, the will behind all of the powers of the sfirot that keeps them the way they are, maintains them in their current mode, so what can you do to change the will? What can be done to change the will? It seems to be impossible to change it from below, and in fact that is true. It is impossible to change it from below. It cannot be changed from below. And the reason that it can't be changed from below is because it's like, kids trying to get their parents to change their mind, right? It doesn't happen. Well, I mean, in some cases it might, obviously, but by way of analogy, it's the secretary telling the boss what to do, right? It just doesn't work. It's not going to happen like that usually. The ordinary citizen doesn't tell the king what to do, right? So, how then are we going to be able to change Keter? What can be done to change the situation? Well, Keter has three aspects, as we mentioned before. The highest of those aspects is Radla, which corresponds to faith. And then delight. Those are prior to precede Arich. Arich is involved with what's below it. It's involved as the controller of everything else. But Arich itself also has a connection up to higher things. As far as we're concerned, Arich is the source of our existence, right? That aspect called Arich, which again corresponds to the will in the human soul. So, Arich is also connected up above. The will can be changed in one of two ways, by two other forces in Keter. One of those forces, again, is faith, Radla, and the other one is delight, Atik. Now, it can sometimes happen because of the nature of Keter. It can sometimes happen that Arich can change one's delight as well. For instance, things that would usually delight you, for various reasons, you have a will to not get any delight from that particular thing. You can sort of overcome the delight to a certain extent. But when you have both of these together, faith and delight together, then the will becomes compliant. The will follows faith and delight rather than dominating faith and delight. So therefore, how does it work, therefore, changing one's will? I go about it in the following way. First of all, faith in the Almighty. And faith, like we saw in the story that the Baal Shem Tov had, he said, there's nothing I can do from my point of view, from my position, there's nothing I can do. We have to have faith that it will be done. It doesn't have to be done by me, but it will be done. God will make sure that it happens in the right way. Faith. But that faith was also accompanied by a certain amount of joy. We see that the decree that the Baal Shem Tov spoke about was only overcome when this couple was in a state of joy and they were dancing around and they were happy. And at that point, that was what caused tremendous delight on high. And that changed the decree, that changed the will that had been already, let's say, promulgated, or had already been that the will of that this community would be destroyed had already been accessed for whatever reason. We don't know what the reason was. It didn't say what the reason behind it was. But in any event, that was now able to be changed. But it was changed from within. It wasn't changed from below. It was changed from above. Right? So The same thing now applies. Let's talk about it in terms of not the decree, but let's talk about it in terms of a person's behavior. Let's say you have a very strong will for some particular thing, but you know that it's not good for you. It's not the right thing. For instance, a person has a will, let's say, to fame, right? He wants to be famous. He wants to be, and he's pushing himself always to try and get himself more honor and more fame and so on and so forth. And there are people like that. So how would one undo such a thing when you know that it's not to your benefit? It's destructive. First of all, the most important thing again is a declaration of faith. I believe I believe with perfect faith that the Creator knows what's best for me. And if I do become famous, it'll be as a sort of an incidental thing, but it's not my primary goal in life. And whatever will be, will be. And I'm going to enjoy things the way they are. I'm going to delight in whatever it is that I can do on the positive side of things without having to have it done my way. You know, there used to be an old song, I Did It My Way. I forget how it goes, but I think Frank Sinatra or something like that. I just remember some of the words. But I did this, I did that, but I did it my way. Now, yes, there is a concept of doing things your way. Everyone has to do them. Like you can't do it somebody else's way. But we try and do things in God's way. In other words, we try and figure out what it is that God wants from us, and then we try and comply to the best of our abilities. To overcome our own overarching and sometimes overbearing will that it has to be my way or the highway kind of thing. So we have to come to trusting in God, trusting that things are going to work out in the best possible way, even if it's not the way I want, and experiencing joy and delight in life and in things, even the way they are, even though they're not perfect. Now, obviously, if you're talking about human suffering and so on and so forth, yes, one has to do whatever one can to overcome somebody else's suffering, to try and help out in any way possible, to try and alleviate the suffering, to try, pray and so on and so forth, and make sure that it doesn't, you do whatever you can. However, to demand that things have to be my way and the way I understand and the way I want it to be is self-destructive. Coming to an understanding that I don't run God's universe, He runs His universe, and I'm not in a position to be able to tell Him what to do. So let Him do it the way He sees fit, and whatever it will be, whatever the end result will be, I will take it with great joy and humility, and therefore that is able to change over a person's will from it must be the way I want it to be to let it be the way God wants it to be. Right? So that demands faith and delight, and that's basically the concept Kabbalistically of how to change a person's will. Now, interestingly enough, you see that although this is one of the secrets of Kabbalah, and it's explained at great length in Kabbalah, this particular concept, you see that organizations such as Alcoholics Anonymous also hit upon, they discovered this idea that your first steps is first of all, of course, to realize that one's out of control, right? I'm out of control. I'm not in control of myself. I'm talking about an alcoholic would be saying this to himself. I'm not in control, but God is in control, right? I'm giving it over to you, he says, and you do the best that you can with my shortcomings. And that's sort of an expression of the same kind of idea, that the superpower of the soul is faith, and just below it, delight. They can overcome everything, right? They can deal with even a stubborn will that I have to have it this way, if one is willing to allow oneself open to change. So that's basically the idea. And Let me see here. I think there's some questions that I've not been following the chat, so let me see here. Yeah. All right, so Terry asked a good question. How could it be that the husband was defending the will of God and he lost the argument? Very good question. Excellent question, in fact. Because we do have to see things from our point of view. In other words, what his wife was saying is, if I was a parent, I would not let such a thing happen, right? If I was the parent, I don't know how God is doing it. Yes, he knows better than I than me what he's doing. But if I was the parent, I would not let that happen. And ultimately, there's a Talmudic discussion, a very interesting story actually, about an argument between various rabbis. What had happened was as follows. It's an interesting story. I'll tell you the story. It's a story told in the tractate Bava Metzia. And the story is as follows. There was a very inventive fellow by the name of Achnai. That was his name, Achnai. Now, in those days, in the days of the sages that we're talking about, in those days, they observed the laws of purity and impurity. Today, many of those laws we don't observe today because we can't. We have no way of purifying the impure to the extent that they need to be purified. Purification from contact with the dead can only be done with the ashes of the red heifer, which we don't have today. Simply because we don't have the Beit HaMikdash, we don't have the temple, and therefore it's impossible to do it, the temple in Jerusalem. It's impossible to do it, but nevertheless, in the time of the sages of the Mishnah, the age of the early Tanaim, the Tana means the authors of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the statement of the oral law, which is handed down from Moses onwards all the way through the generations. So, in the time of the Second Temple, towards the end of the Second Temple, about 2,000 years ago, maybe a little over 2,000 years ago, an argument ensued with this fellow, regarding this fellow Achnai. Achnai was an inventor, and what he did was, he invented an oven that one could very easily purify without much effort. So what would happen in those days very often is the ovens were made out of clay. They baked the clay very, very hard, and then they used those clays. They built the fire inside the oven, this clay oven, and there was a hole on the top of the oven or whatever it was, like a stove, and that's how they used they used the oven. However, if a sheretz is a creepy crawly of some sort, it got into an insect, or it could even be an insect, could be a rat, could be other things, got into the oven, the oven became tameh. Now, usually if something becomes tameh, a metal object, for instance, becomes tameh, becomes ritually impure, you just take it to a pool of water, a body of water called a mikveh, and you dip it in the mikveh and it becomes kosher, right? It's just dipping it in that source of water. It has to be a certain amount of water and so on, certain conditions. But you dip it in the water in that mikveh, you take it out, and the thing would be kosher. But you can't do that with a clay oven, because if you dip it in water, it disintegrates, right? So what do you do with a clay oven that became tameh, that became ritually impure? Nothing. You can't do anything. You have to smash it, throw it away, and it's finished, right? But Achnai had a great invention. What did he do? He had the oven made out of various parts that fit together. So if the oven would become impure, and being that there were a lot of bugs around in that era and in those parts of the world, very hot areas of the world, in Babylon and Israel and so on, so ovens would often become impure as a result. So when the oven was impure, what you could do is you could just take it apart, right? You take it apart into its various. It was like a Lego thing, it was put together as parts. Right, you take it apart, and that's like breaking it into pieces and put it back again. It's a new oven already, right? So that was his invention. Brilliant invention. He went to the great Rabbi Eliezer of that generation, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hukanus, and he asked Rabbi Eliezer to give him a stamp of approval, with its kosher, that it can be used for. Rabbi Eliezer was delighted with the idea, and he said, go ahead, yeah, perfect, it's fine. But being an enterprising fellow, he wanted to get all the rabbis on board. So he went and he asked some of the other rabbis. One Rabbi Yeshua said, "No good. Yeah, you can't do that. Not gonna make it kosher." So an argument ensued between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua about their varying points of view and what the law in the end, how the law in the end was going to be decided. So they're arguing backwards and forwards about the various pros and cons of each theory, of each opinion. And Rabbi Eliezer eventually gets frustrated. He can't win the argument. He's not losing the argument. He can't win the argument. He gets a bit frustrated. And he said, if I'm right, let the tree that is outside the study hall move 100 amas, 100 yards, 150 yards actually, 150 yards out away from where it is now. And the tree moved there, right? How the tree moved there, we don't know. Obviously, it was a miraculous thing, but he had such powers. He was Rabbi Eliezer the Great, as he was called. So Rabbi Yeshua responded and he said, trees don't decide Jewish law. So he said, well, if I'm right then, let the river which runs past the study hall, let it reverse course and run uphill. And the river ran uphill for a period of time. But Rabbi Yeshua said the rivers also don't decide Jewish law. It's the Chachomim, the sages that decide, and most of the Chachomim agree with me, not with you. So they looked in the study hall, the sages were all gathered together, and they were agreeing with Rabbi Yeshua. So he said, if I'm right, let the walls of the base medrash or the walls of the study house collapse upon us. Don't know why he would have done that, but that's what he said. And Rabbi Yeshua rebuked them and said, you cannot fall on top of the Chachomim. And the walls sort of caved in a little bit, but they didn't actually fall in. And then Rabbi Yeshua brought out his ace, the trump card, and he said, if I'm right, let a voice come out of heaven and proclaim that I'm right. And a voice came out of heaven and said, my son, Rabbi Eliezer, is correct. His opinion is the correct opinion. And Rabbi Yeshua stood up and he said, Jewish law is no longer decided in heaven. The Torah was given to the Jewish people. The law was given to the Jewish people for us to decide, and we make the rules. Like we decide the law here. And since the majority of sages disagree, the law is like the majority, because that's what it says in the Torah. The law is like the majority. And then another voice came out of heaven and said, Nitzchuni bona nitzchuni. You have overpowered me, my sons, you have overpowered me. Right? In other words, God says, he let out an announcement, I lost this argument. Right? I lost this argument. And he said it, but with joy in his voice, with pride, so to speak. The Gemara and then the commentaries explain that God said with pride, you have beaten me at my own game. Right? You beat me in the argument. Now you might ask how this is obviously only an analogy, whether it actually happened in exactly this way, and how we would have experienced it had we been there is a question you can ask. But nevertheless, that is the bottom line. That's what happened in the law. Therefore, it decided according to Rabbi Yeshua, not according to Rabbi Eliezer. So why am I saying this? Because God's will can be changed, right? His will isn't always what you think it is. There's what appears on the surface of things, which would be arich, but there's a deeper level to it, the level of faith and delight, which can change, right? That can change the will, God's will. And we see that it does, and that's why prayer can also sometimes change God's will, and so on and so forth. Okay, so Terry, to answer you, Terry, therefore, how could it be that the husband defended the will of God and lost the argument? Because God was willing to lose that argument also, right? He was willing to lose the argument, and that's just the way things are. So, right, just changed from above. Yep. The letter of Nachmanides is the Ramban. Nachmanides is the Ramban, not the Rambam. The Ramban could help. Yes, it could help in certain circumstances. Yes. There's also Psalms. You can say Psalms. Psalms certainly help. How can one keep from complaining the process of change with suffering? I think the answer to that is a much lengthier answer, and that one has to examine much more the circumstances around the complaint, etc. But the basic idea is that you have to be what's called solutions focused. You have to focus on solutions and not the problems. 1 second. Turn that phone off. Okay, once you focus on the solution, the problem kind of takes care of itself. If you focus on the problems, there's always going to be arguments, right? Always going to be, what's the cause of the problem? Where did it come from? Why is it like this? If we don't even look at what the causes of the problem are, because everyone's going to have a different explanation as to what the causes are. You might agree, but it's very likely that different people will have different understandings of why the problem occurred in the first place. If we don't look for why the problem occurred, it happened, but let's look for a solution, rather than examine the problem and analyze the problem, then you're much more likely to come to a consensus that this is the solution. It has to be a consensus solution, right? Everyone has to agree that this is the correct solution. And if that doesn't work, you try something else. But solution focus is the way to deal with the process of change. Even if there's suffering involved, that is usually the best way to do it. Of course, you're trying to alleviate the suffering as much as possible. And suffering, to a very large extent, is a mental state. Suffering is not necessarily, physical pain. Pain is something one experiences in the mind. Yes, there are pain, and of course, there's nerves and things like that, and it's a natural thing and a proper thing to feel pain. People who don't feel pain are actually in great danger. There are people that don't feel pain and they're in great danger because something could happen. That I remember reading about a case once of a girl was walking around on a broken ankle for 2 weeks before her parents saw that her foot was like really swollen, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. She was a girl that for some reason or another genetically has something happened. She did not feel pain, right? She didn't feel physical pain. Now, emotional pain people also feel, but there's a way of dealing with emotional pain that an emotional pain is sometimes you accept it as a cleansing process. It's a process that you need to go through sometimes to cleanse yourself, to elevate yourself, to purify yourself. But these things will best be discussed in a sort of a private setting, so we can get a better idea of what's going on. If anyone wants to discuss it, they're welcome to be in touch with me about this. But that's the way to work. Okay. All right. Now, by definition, what is the Torah? The Torah is the will of God, right? The will and the wisdom of God. That's what the definition of Torah is. It's the will and wisdom of God put into writing. Many levels of interpretation, many levels of understanding, but that is basically what the Torah is all about. Perhaps you meant something else, but that's what I would say. So this process can also help with changing one's emotions. Emotions seem the most difficult to change. I'll tell you why the emotions seem the most difficult to change. It's a very good observation. The emotions are most difficult to change, and the reason is because Arich Anpin means the usually it's translated as the long visage or the great visage. Arich Anpin, the long visage. Right now, I'll explain what that means in a second. And the emotions, the 7 emotions of the soul, which are Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, starting with these emotions, are called Zeir Anpin, the smaller visage. Why is this a smaller visage and this is the bigger visage? Because these have their birth in this. The emotions have their birth in the will. That's where they come from, and that's why it's so difficult to change emotions. I'll give you an example. There was a story that I read, I think it was in a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. If I'm not mistaken, I think that was the book that it was in. Anyway, very interesting story that he told about himself. He was on a train, and he was preparing to give a lecture, and he was trying to think the lecture through. But there was a man on the train with 2 or 3 kids, and the kids were going wild, and the guy was just completely ignoring them. And the kids were acting wildly, and they were disrupting, and they were disturbing the passengers, and so on and so forth, and he couldn't think. So someone eventually piped up and said to him, take care of your kids. So he looked at them, and he sort of shook his, he was in a sort of a daze, and he shook himself, all the daze off himself, and he apologized, and he said, I'm really sorry. I just came back from the hospital where my wife and the mother of these children just passed away. She just died. So at that point in time, before he'd said that, everyone was annoyed with him and angry, right? That anger changed immediately to compassion. Changed to compassion because they realized that it's not that he's a lazy parent or someone who just doesn't care about other people's comfort zones. There was a reason for it, right? So similarly, in order to be able to change the emotions, that change really has to come from the will. A person has to want to have that change. He has to want to change. But in order to want to change, so you have to change the faith and delight modes, which give the will its energy, which give it its force. So to change the emotions, really, you have to go back to this as well. Or if the will can be changed in one way or another without going to faith and delight, that's also a possibility. So don't ask why, just focus on what is a solution. That is my advice. That is what I try to do in conflict resolution, whether it's people going through divorce, or whether it's conflict in families, or even sometimes conflict in business, although I don't deal very much with business issues, since I'm not personally a business person. That is the thing to do. There is a book which you might want to get. It's called The Solutions Focus. It's a short little book. I forget who the authors are now. If you drop me an email, I can tell you who the authors of the book are. It's available on Amazon. It's a short, very short book, like something like 60 pages or something like that, and a lot of it is diagrams and big spacing. Peter Szabo, I think that's his name. Just 1 second, let me see. Peter Szabo. I think that's what it's called. I think that's what his name is. I think that's what it is. I'm not 100% sure at this point in time. I could send it to you by, if you email me, I could tell you. In any event, solution-focused theory. There's another book by Paul Jackson called also something with solutions focus. Paul Z. Jackson. Also excellent work on solution-focused therapy, solution-focused issues in business, and so on and so forth. This is definitely the way to go. Most people are coming from a more scientific background. The scientific background usually tries to look at causes and change the cause, and the solutions will appear automatically. However, in human psychology, it doesn't really work like that, because the causes are really unknown. Very often the causes are unknown. The causes could be, as I think Terry would be able to tell you, the causes could be unconscious, subconscious, things that happen in childhood, things we've completely forgotten, or just the way we grew up in the environment in which we grew up affects the way we think and the way we do and the way we emote and the way we feel about things and so on. And it's very difficult to change that if you're looking for the source of it. You're looking for the problem. What exactly is the problem? Where did it come from? What started it? It's not going to help. The thing to do is to look for the solution. That automatically takes care of the problem. It's an automatic thing. So I haven't seen that one, the Susan Ton book. I will have a look. I'll have a look into it and see if I can find. But that is definitely the way to go, and that is the way that I use with my clients as well. Oh, Peter Szabo, I forgot to write that in the chat. I think that's the guy who wrote a very short book, easy to read book. Okay, so Terry again. That which instigates is hardly ever that which perpetuates. Very good saying, a very worthy saying. I think I'll write it down and keep it. That which instigates, in other words, the origin of things is hardly ever that which keeps it going the way it is, right? Now, in Kabbalah, it's much more clear that the union of Arich, the sphere of Arich, is what keeps these things going, because that's the life force, it's the lifeblood of all of the Sfirot, and particularly the emotions. Paul Jackson, Paul Z, I don't know what that stands for, Zach maybe or something, Jackson, but Paul Jackson. If you look up Paul Jackson, you'll find it. Very nice book. Okay, folks, I think I've been talking for too long already. So we will stop over here and